Welcome to the latest podcast, which I think is number 7. We're going to be talking about two films that are fundamentally the same film. One is the new American film called Come As You Are, which has recently just come out in the cinemas. Also, The Guardian did a review of it recently, and they loved it. We'll get more on that a bit later. And also the original, which came out in 2011, called Hasta, Vista, which on IMDb is also called Come As You Are. So I suppose I'll start by saying I was pretty depressed after having watched these two films, which I think is quite understandable, really. And the other thing I'll say is and I'll say a hi to Matt Fraser, because I know he's one of our listeners, and I know he's been very outspoken in the casting issue. I'll add one more thing before we get into it. There is also a third version of this film made in 2016, which is a Dutch film, which, given that Come As You Are is Flemish, is a little bit baffling. And that's called Adios Amigos. And I haven't been able to see it, but looking at it, it looks pretty much like the same film. So let's start with you, Alison. What do you think?
Start with me. Just anything.
Anything.
Right. Okay. Better than some. These were both better than some of the films that we've watched, but yeah, it's quite complicated actually, because I think of the two films, the first one was definitely the better.
The first one being the Belgian one.
And I think there's, I'm sure we'll come back to this, but I think there's a problem in taking it out of the cultural context. And I know that there's actually been something written on that cultural context anyway, which is in, I think, what's his name? Benjamin Fraser's book, Culture's Representation. A woman called Anna Grebe writes about On the Road to Normalcy. I don't know if you've seen that. So I think, putting that aside, there's an issue in actually ripping it from its original cultural context and putting it in America. But having said that, I think we can also say that about which is what, I think there's been some critique in another journal article on that. So clearly there's been a fair bit of academic work on this anyway, is that as difficult and as it may be, and as many different opinions as we may have on this, the whole impetus for the film in the first place was based on original road trip, and that was all. The whole reason this was made in the first place, as far as I understand it, is to look at actually issues around sexual rights. The second film won with that to some degree, but it wasn't as strong in terms of actually that very blatant search to get rid of virginity. It had its problems in that, in some way, and women, I think women were problematic in both films. And of course, that discussions around sexual rights and disability, is a lot of them do presume a male disabled person. But yeah, the first one I think was the best. Having said that, I liked the diversity in the second film, although it felt a bit tick box with one person from who was East Asian, one who was South Asian, a black person. It was kind of like there was a bit of that going on as well. But having said that, the first film was very white. So I'll leave it there for now and let you take up some of those issues maybe.
Well, let me ask you another question, actually, because I haven't read a lot of that academic work that you've said, and it says about cultural context. Can you remember what it is in essence?
Sorry, what, in the Benjamin Fraser book?
Yeah.
It's actually, I think that one in the Benjamin Fraser book is generally, it compares 3 different films, I think, on European road movies. But I think the one about cultural context, basically, that in the first film, we kind of saw conversations between the driver and them about talking Flemish and things like that. So the parental, and of course that's an issue in both of these things, running away from their parents as kind of the main oppressor, was kind of also very much set in a Flemish cultural context.
Right.
And that kind of, I think, echoed throughout the film, although I don't know enough about that culture to be able to analyse how. But the particular thing that the particular paper that I'm talking about says how that when it's uprooted from there, it actually doesn't, it becomes a very different film. And those kind of, I think it's that kind of specificity of disableism within particular cultural context. So there's a big question there about how much, you know, is same with Bollywood. If you check, if Bollywood does a Western film and vice versa, it's like how much of that actually transfers. So I think there's quite important questions around that, which I don't feel quite equipped to answer, to be honest.
Right. Miro, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they're not great films, and they're not films I would go back and watch anytime soon. I think there are some key concepts and subject matters that could be explored in further detail in terms of, you know, as a response to the film. So picking up on Alison's points, thinking about ideas of sexuality, of sexual rights as well, and having access to explore your sexual identity. There is the issue of support, and how support is primarily, in the context of these films, given by family members, which creates problems then for the self-determination of the disabled characters. And of course, it's that yearning for choice and control, of having in participating in different environments, which is led by the individuals, which comes out. And I think that those are the kind of key messages. But I think, you know, looking at the two films, I absolutely agree with Alison. With the Flemish film, you've got this notion of kind of breaking away from the family's segregative and protectionist agenda, and trying to and by doing that is also trying to explore aspects of sexuality and relationships, and also a building of a social network, which is then determined by the individuals rather than, say, the family. In the American film, it's very much about that individualism of losing your virginity, of the instant paid gratification that comes from seeking out sex workers. And it's interesting how women are positioned in both films. I think both films, you know, position women very problematically. But in the American one, I was really taken back by how the majority of the women characters are objectified, sexualized, to the point where actually some of the characters you don't even see their faces, you only see their bodies. In the sense, you know, the first person in the dream sequence, you only see the body. When they when I think Scotty is amazed by the disabled baseball player, his relationship with his partner, you don't see her face, you just see her body and what Scotty's looking at. And later on as well, when they meet different people, just this kind of throwaway characters. It's all about not necessarily seeing the face. It's all about objectifying the body and reinforcing that aggressive pursuit for a heterosexual normative sexual interaction. And I think, you know, some other key points as well. I was interested in that notion of the family dynamics and the way that the family then reflect on their attitudes and their behaviors towards the disabled children. And it was really interesting because particularly in the American one, you had the situation where the family, going further, then discuss between themselves about whether it's appropriate or not. But even though I interpreted it as they were then starting to question their authoritarianism around their disabled children, they still then thought it was acceptable to decide what was going to happen next, decide the parameters of what they were going to experience in terms of the hotel and where they were going to stay and so on. So even though it was supposed to be perceived as the main characters were now able to have their own level of self-determination, actually it was still controlled by the individuals. And it reminds me of I think it's Emmons' research on sexuality and relationships, and that idea that, you know, it's the state and the the community that determines who we interact with and who we have the chance to fall in love with, or who we have affection for. And that's very much part of these films, but it's misplaced, I think, because of that narrative of the individual triumphing beyond their impairment effects, beyond their the barriers that they believe that is a result of themselves rather than the way society is organized. And the film becomes them trying to use a road movie to navigate some of those barriers without perhaps making emphasis on the broader physical and community institutional practices that deny disabled people opportunities to explore their sexuality.
Well, I wouldn't dispute any of that. I think they're both irredeemably bad movies, actually. I think there's very little good about either of them, in the sense that as movies within the kind of normality drama kind of genre, they're pretty cliched, pretty unoriginal. And talking about them in relation to one's a remake of the other one, and then there was the one in the middle as well. The deviation between them, I think, is startlingly unoriginal, and whole scenes, whole kind of directorship elements, script elements, acting elements are just duplicated, which I think is a real tragedy and a lack of imagination that is quite startling. I think, to me, the casting is an issue. I don't generally have an issue. I do have an issue with it per se, given that it's about the kind of structural imbalance. But I understand why a film needs a star. But you could say, well, you could have everyone around the disabled character as a star in order to give it that legitimacy and that power. You could still have a disabled actor. But when you're talking about three films, 9 actors, every single one of them is a non-disabled actor. That's astounding. I found that there was very little of any significance in either film, other than the exploration of, disabled people exploring sexuality, etc. But even that, I thought it was done incredibly badly, because I think that it was purely within a kind of normalizing context. And I think it's funny, because I preferred the American version to the Belgian version. And one of the key reasons for me was the one scene after they have sex in the Belgian film, which is the scene where they...
I've got a head, sorry. Yeah, go on.
Where they all have sex, and then there's a little dream sequence of them all being normal, in quotes. The two in the wheelchairs are walking, and the visually impaired guy, it can see. It's very brief, and it's beautifully sunny, and that was such a disappointment to add that scene, that I thought it was really odd. And I was really pleased that the American movie, which is the one I would have expected to do that, didn't do it. And I thought that was so much better to not do that. But I did find that both were pretty irredeemably bad. And if we come back to the casting issue, I think, 3 films, 3 actors in each, 9 disabled characters, none of them played by disabled people, is pretty much a crime against humanity to some extent. I thought there was very little that was redeemable for either film, and I think one of the key issues for me was that it was sexist, racist. I think it was probably even a little bit homophobic. I can't remember a bit in particular. But I think a key problem for me was summed up by probably one of the very few quite different scenes. And it's when, in the original Flemish film, they've all just had sex, and then there's a dream sequence where they're all, in quotes, normal for a few moments. It's bright sunshine, they're all perfect. The 2 in the wheelchairs can walk, and the one who can't see can see. And one of the best things about the American film, Come As You Are, the new one, was that they didn't replicate that scene, which surprised me considerably. But actually, I thought that was one of the best things about it. But given what Alison said earlier about the kind of tick box exercise that was very evident in the American version, that the scene with the driver, who was very famous for being precious, Gabourey Sidibe, she says at the funeral some crass line about, we can all live our dream. And given the kind of notion of intersectionality and the parallels between racism, sexism, disableism, that line was just offensive. And a wasted opportunity, not offensive because you're reading a script, you're getting paid, but actually a missed opportunity of staggering potential thrown away. What do you think of that statement from me then?
No, I agree. I think there was I know. I think my issue was that I read it a lot, and I know Alison, I think you disagreed, but I couldn't really hear you because I think the signal went. But I got the feeling a lot of that they were trying to emphasize this triumph over adversity, because in the bits where Scotty is doing his rapping, loads of it is about kind of making peace with his body. I think is one of the lyrics that he uses. Talking about the limitations of his body, the restrictions placed upon him. Then there are some really bizarre moments when you have this scene where he drops his phone, and then the camera spends a good 3 or 4 minutes just following him, how he tries to pick up his phone. Bits when they all decide to drive the vehicle themselves, when when Sam is hospitalized. So it's just that narrative of dismiss the broader institutionalized practices associated with society, the issues that actually affect how we perceive ourselves and also our sexuality and desire for relationships, or the denied access to relationships. And again, I think at the end of the film, that just that's how it summarizes. But there is loads of problems. Even if you take the issue of how sexuality is represented in the film, particularly in the American one, it's really aggressive heterosexuality, normative ideas of sexual intercourse. It doesn't account for anything in the variance of sexual identity in terms of asexuality or in terms of LGBT identity. So there's so many problems with it in terms of how it portrays it. And I think then I think it's really harmful in the way that it just reinforces that narrative of do what you can and spend time making peace with yourself, because that's how you can then try to overcome some of these feelings that you've had about your identity or about your pursuit of relationships.
I don't think it's. I don't think that that's the only problem with that. I think it doesn't stick like the first one did to that very raw thing of we actually want to. We want to be able to access sex just on that very heterosexual male thing. It doesn't even do that well, because it's almost like there's this secret thing that, well, actually they don't really just want sexual experience, just a sexual experience, which I think is really bad, because it's like really they're after a relationship, and I react quite strongly to that. It's like what's wrong with and I mean, you did say about normativity, and that's part of normativity, is what's wrong actually in just wanting sex outside of a relationship. Mm-hmm. It just kept leaning towards that, and that moment that you said, Paul, when you said how good it was to see them come out in the wheelchairs. Yes, I agree with that, because the other one was horrendous for that kind of heavenly type of, and now we're flying. The first thing that they see on top of this, supposed glory of having sex, which turns out not to be glorious for them, is that their other friend has become a couple, which is all you get the feeling that's all we really wanted in the first place. And as much as there's an issue of disabled people and rights to live full relationships, whatever they are, it's like, well, actually, I thought they were after sex. It's like it just does it goes so far away from the original intention of the first film. Mm. it becomes meaningless.
Absolutely. So, and that's why I think there's, because they both fall into that into varying degrees. Although, and again, I think the to me a big problem is with the driver slash nurse slash helper in both films. I think is quite problematic. I think and again less so in the Belgian film actually, because I think they play around with some of those cultural contexts that are very specific about language. You know, French and Flemish. And where they're playing off against one another. And I think that whole thing about the Flemish being linked to Belgium as a kind of multinational state within its own existence. And I think it covers that to some extent, which again, the American one doesn't have. I thought what was interesting is what I did quite enjoy looking at in relation to them were the differences. And one of the key differences in the narrative was, and I'd forgotten this until I watched it again, because I watched the American one first before I watched the Belgian one again, was that whole narrative thrust of you don't, or some of the characters don't know that one of the characters is going to die in it till quite late in the American version, whereas that's quite explicit in the Belgian version from the beginning. And that may come back to that cultural context of like Flemish is going to die in you know, he represents Flanders, etc., in a kind of Belgian context. But you know, even not knowing that, but that whole notion of telling you that he's going to die, because then once that's at the beginning of the film, in the Flemish one in particular, you know he's then going to die at the end. Whereas they save that till like 2/3 of the way through in the American film. And what did you think of that, Miro?
No, I think that's quite interesting, and even the way that's depicted in the American film, in the sense of to show the deterioration of his health, you know, and the use of medicine by Matt, you know, in that sense of when he's taking his tablets and his medication in the vehicle, it's, you know, it's a real point of curiosity for Sam outside the vehicle. Then later on, when he's trying to pursue activity with the woman in the jazz club, and then again, it's kind of, you know, that his impairment and the effects of his impairment prevents him and denies him from exploring that further. Until you said this, I hadn't really connected the two together really in that. But no, it certainly made me think about actually the broader cultural context of what it's trying to say, particularly in the Flemish film. But yeah, in the American film, I don't necessarily see what the relevance is of having the character die off, which is something I would like to think about a little bit further.
Alison?
What was the question you asked me and Miro again? I was busy listening to Miro, so I've forgotten it.
I was just thinking about how the kind of idea that in the Flemish one, you know that the character's going to die pretty much from the beginning. And in the American one, they hold that back to like 2/3 of the way through.
I mean, I don't know if it was important at all, to be honest, but I kind of liked that whole performance in the first one better, and I found myself more anchored. It helped with the coherency of the film to expect him to die. I suppose it was done so much better as well in the first film.
Because to some extent, I saw it as being about a hierarchy, kind of like, you know, you may well be a quadriplegic, but stop fucking complaining. You know, that's not as bad as going to die. And there was that whole hierarchy of the impairments within each film.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was, you know, a little bit crass on kind of every level. And again, depoliticizing the whole notion of disablement, for example.
Although it has to be said, at least they didn't buy into the usual tropes around visual impairment, which was possibly the most refreshing thing about either film, is that we didn't get an over-sexualized man with a visual impairment.
Although you did have quite a bit, particularly in the American one, which I don't particularly remember in the other one, that touching feeling at least he didn't feel her face, which I thought was a bit of a bonus. But he was feeling it was all about the touch and all that kind of stuff. Which
I think on the kind of if you marked each stereotype, I think that's probably the lesser of the evils. The one which I hinted at earlier to you was which I found unforgivable was I've forgotten her name again, Delaney Fina at the end of the second film, the one disabled person that I'm aware of that was involved in the film, being the booby prize at the end. And
I think we've got to rethink that phrase, booby prize, don't you?
As well, very much in the usual. Pardon?
We've got to rethink the phrase booby prize.
No, I stand by that. I stand by that, and it's just so passive. I mean, we've in the past 10 years we've gone so far with disabled women's representation, and that was just pitiful. But yet she was the only disabled person that I was aware of. So, so that to me rated higher on the Rotten Tomatoes scale, as it were, for things gone wrong.
I also think in the American film that I was interested in some of the fringe characters. They use the awkward interactions with a disabled person as a source of comedy as well. So I think. When Matt goes to meet his girlfriend and sees that there's something brewing with I think it's Bobby, and the kind of the lingering shots on Bobby being really uncomfortable and not realizing that this person was dating a wheelchair user at the site, so using the site of impairment to reinforce those ideas of uncomfortableness, but actually do it in a way which is supposed to ridicule the situation. And yet all it actually plays off as is actually this individual who's being pushed out of his relationship with his partner. And his partner just, I think I was astounded by the line that his partner uses when she says to him in the library, I need to start thinking about the future. And perhaps, therefore you as a disabled person is not a viable option for the future. And then of course later on as well, you get the interaction with the police officer and his terminology that he uses. And again, it's that, I just thought it was really like the kind of the old tropes of using the uncomfortableness of being around disabled people.
I guess there's a certain truth is that in the fact that she knew he was dying.
Yes.
So there is a very kind of there is a very kind of real issue there if your partner's dying and your heart's breaking. So, but I agree with you actually. But
sure, but I think I agree. But I think at that point, unless I'm mistaken, at that point, as the audience, you're not aware of the terminal illness.
Absolutely. So she, and equally, as he's dying, she hasn't got to worry about that much into the future anyway, is she? So
no, but in that respect, it's very much like Me Before You. It's like it's all about preparing her for a future, which seems a bit odd because she was a very marginal character. So why would we care about her future?
To me, one of the big problems was that terrible issue of infantilizing disabled people, which again works much better in the Flemish film because they are very young in the Flemish film, and that's a part of it. I think is about becoming teenagers and adults and that whole thing there, which has a kind of greater resonance. Whereas they're all much older in the American version, and though bizarrely they all try to play younger. He says his age at one point, and the actual actor is only like 5 years older. It seemed quite a random thing. He could have just made it on a par. But I thought that kind of the cliche of infantilizing disabled people was much more prevalent in the American one because they were so much older, which were you either excusing the younger one or it's part of that process of all adolescence, etc. What did you think of that? As a parallel between the two, I think was interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I think I said at the beginning, although I don't know if I have a problem with the way, again, particularly in the American. I had a lot of problems with the American one, in the way that the parents are positioned, because you have this kind of protectionist family dynamics where they are reducing the self-determination of the characters. And then, of course, when they catch up with them in the hotel and they have that full-blown argument where it's revealed about what the whole idea of the road trip is, I interpret that as, you're supposed to then kind of empathize with how the parents are starting to change their perspectives and think about, okay, maybe we should support this. But really what they're doing is they're just giving permission for the young people not even young people, for the adults to kind of carry on with their road trip, which of course is entirely up to the individual's choice. But yeah, it's that question of, well, even though the parents have now come to terms with the idea of what it is that they're trying to do, there still requires the parents to give the permission to create the parameters of what they will have in terms of choice and control, and of course then to determine where they stay and what they do, on the subsequent journey of the road trip. So I think that it could have been a way to explore the dynamics of how families can also institutionalize people, particularly when we're talking about single people trying to explore their sexual identity. And yeah, I think it just fell for that cliche of parents determining self-determination, and then through the revelation of realizing that their children want to have choice and control over what they do, they are then still required to be in a position to authorize that and permit that.
I find that quite interesting, actually, because I obviously I agree with you. But on the other hand, it's back to that kind of the issue that dogs, representations of disability, in that, I mean, that the parents, in a way, stand in for society disabling people, and of course stand in for themselves as people who often do disable their own children. But the fact is, as a disabled person, and having seen many of the disabled people in the same situation, just about any power that I manage to get in society is given to me by non-disabled people. It's like I'm always, it's always contingent on them allowing me in or not.
Yep.
So there's a very real issue. I mean, these films weren't the films to deal with it, because of course once that was given, that just kind of disappeared. But myself, I'm quite interested in that tension there anyway. And there's lots of tensions in the film, if we're kind to them, about that kind of sameness and difference, and kind of freedom and not freedom, and all those sort of things. So in one way, I kind of don't mind, in a way, that we see that it's contingent once again upon the permission of the people who disable us, because that's something nobody's really worked out how to escape, has it?
Sure. I think again, just to kind of add to that, you've got the extensive way in which the disabled characters create those forms of resistance, of breaking out, using our lives in terms of siblings to establish ways of getting out. The various ways in which they try to resist their parents, and yeah, absolutely, as you say, it then just kind of falls back to the parents' approval. But I suppose, in my view, it was I know I think Paul said before, we should never try to imagine the film as what it should, as something else, because it's not. It's this. But yeah, that was that for me, I was desperately wanting them to just kind of, although I know what the film is going to happen because I've seen the original, but I wanted a situation where they would just kind of dismiss completely what their parents would do and challenge that and say, actually, we're adults and we'll decide, we've paid for it and this, and we'll decide what happens next. It was almost like legitimizing that idea of, well, yeah, the parents have come around to their way of thinking, and it's fair that they've kind of diplomatically decided what happens next, which I think was a bit problematic for them.
But equally, I would say, because I agree with you, Alison, what you're saying about how that allowing you to have some kind of power is bestowed on you by non-disabled people, by non-minority, etc. And I think one of the problems for me in a film like this is it had an opportunity to explore that process rather than just passively show it and reinforce it as perfectly ordinary. And because that continues even right through to the funeral, when he starts to rap and the father says to the priest, literally with the sign of it, just let him do it. It's kind of like, it's the bestowing of power, which it wouldn't have been that difficult to show that process and been critical of it. by actually reflecting it back onto the parents. I think, you know, some of the best films about racism, for example, are where the younger people may reflect onto their parents how they've allowed that to happen, or not allowed, or been unconsciously passive in that. And I think this had opportunities to be able to do that. For example, in the main characters, I presume it was a single mother, although that wasn't the case in the Belgian one, but you never see the father in that one. And there were whole elements that you thought, you literally, a line here and there could have given it so much more significance and power, that then, given that, particularly the American one, it is just a pure tick box, to then have no comprehension of why you're doing a tick box exercise in representing cultural diversity, because all you do in representing cultural diversity as a tick box exercise is reinforcing the values that make you have to do a tick box exercise in the most banal and tokenistic way, which I think was a terrible missed opportunity, apart from all the other elements.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm saying? And, you know, like, for example, I think your thing about, like, there's no problem in just having sex for the sake of sex. And I think this was an opportunity, particularly given the debates around sex, you know, that the Hasta Philpott, I think his name is, Hasta Philpott, who actually appears in both of them in different elements, who did the BBC documentary that was followed, that these are rooted in, and he affected the script, to actually take that, because that is about the pure experience of sex outside of a relationship, and that lack of, you know, you don't need to have a relationship to do that. That's the kind of normative bourgeois banality of the kind of version of life. That his involvement in both films, he actually appears in it in the beginning of the Belgian one, and then at the end in documentary footage showing you who he is, both with claims to it being true story stuff, to actually take out the politics of what Hasta Philpott was trying to create, was a real tragedy and a missed opportunity on every level.
Of course, there's an additional point there as well. You know, the idea of going to the sex workers, it has to be special. It has to be specialist sex workers. So it's not. It's, you know, it reinforced the idea of, well, even if you do want to just pursue the sexual experience and to engage in sexual in sex, the characters are forced to go and find this specialized service which will cater just for them, rather than try to actually, you know, think about how to ensure that still people have accessible experiences of engaging in sex and sexuality. But again, it's seen as kind of specialized. It's seen as almost to the point of being kind of almost being medicalized in the way that they deliver it. It's I just thought that was interesting as well, like the kind of the segregated nature of, well, we want this, but we have to then pursue this specialist service in order to experience it.
But equally, what's interesting about that in particularly these two that we're talking about, I don't particularly know about the Dutch one, they have to go to a different country for that as well, yeah. Which again I think is quite interesting, and it's saying something about, like, our country's backward or our country's forward, that it doesn't allow it. It's not quite sure what it's saying. But any comments on that, Alison?
Not really, because a lot of what I've just heard was muffled, so I wouldn't be secure in thinking that. Okay,
I think what will were there any other differences? Were there any other differences between the two films, as films, in their kind of narrative thrust and the way they were made, given that they are basically the same script, that you thought were interesting at all, Miro?
We'll start with Alison. I'm just
Alison.
What was the question again? Because again, that was a bit muffled.
In relation to the differences in how it was presented, given that it's fundamentally the same script, like we've spoken about the dream sequence that was in one, and the keeping secret the guy was going to die in the other. Were there any other differences that you thought were interesting?
I'm probably going to swerve that question completely and say actually what they kept in was more interesting to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, they kept in the death in the second one, but they made it much more sanitized, didn't they? Because in the first one, it kind of was heightened by the fact that he nearly went out to sea. And in the second one, he was way back from the sea, and that really mattered to me. And it's just, I wonder why they did that, given that the first one had a nicer, I think, dramatic feel to it, dead and out to sea, as it were. But one thing that I particularly didn't like about both films, and I'm like, why did they repeat that? And, you know, as a signifier, I think this was something which was the individualistic kind of perspective that was the driver of both films, which was the mum, and of course it'd have to be the mum feeding, I've forgotten his name now, the mum feeding him and watching the TV at the same time. Yeah. And kind of getting it a bit wrong, and that's quite triggering for me, given what happened to my sister. But it's like, and partly I want to shout at the screen, not feeding disabled people, you know, wrongly, is not just a signifier of the you know, or we should treat disabled people better. It could actually kill us. Yeah. And I thought, why keep that in? It was almost the same. It was almost the same as the first film. Yep. So I was quite interested, given that they veered from the script quite a lot in some things, even reversed. I found what they kept in really, really instructive on what the filmmaker was trying to achieve, really.
Yep. So, Miro, anything on that?
No, nothing to add. I think.
To me, I think I want to go back to the casting thing, because I thought that was quite what we can say about that can make absolute difference. And given that I've recently read some book proposals that mentions about different changes by some legendary writer that I know, I'm interested in how we think. For example, I think I said earlier, and I hope I said earlier and we caught it, about how the casting, you know, I think what was interesting that, you know, 3 different movies, 9 different disabled characters, all played by non-disabled people. What I find interesting is the splintering of other disabled people, not splintering, the sprinkling of real, in quotes, disabled people around the periphery to give that legitimacy. And there's the baseball game in particular in the American one, and then again the receptionist is disabled, who's the booby prize at the end, and then in the first one it's the wine tasting thing, which is full of disabled people. And again, that's an old kind of method of giving legitimacy, even from things like The Men with Marlon Brando right up to Coming Home. The main character is not a disabled person, but someone pretending to be. But you sprinkle real disabled people around the edges to give it a kind of degree of legitimacy, which of course I think it doesn't particularly work, because it's about the narrative. And would you agree that the importance of casting real disabled people in these kind of roles will fundamentally affect the narrative thrust to give it a kind of greater truth and insight and kind of depth? But equally that isn't intrinsically true either, because often, just for example, the script is often pre-written and then they're slotted in, and how much would they be affected to change that? So what do you think, Alison?
I didn't get all of that, but I think you were basically asking about whether there's an intrinsic difference between having disabled people cast.
Yep.
And I think actually, in the abstract, I know it probably won't be popular. I found it woeful that all of these characters were non-disabled. I think in an ideal situation, you know, where disabled people get all roles, my position hasn't changed on this. I think that it's equally true that disabled people can bring truth to non-disabled roles and vice versa. But as a disabled person watching these, the kind of strength of having 3 non-disabled actors was way too much. But that's partly an issue about knowledge. I decided to go into the first one not knowing whether they were disabled or not, but I found myself Googling it halfway through because maybe, to contradict myself, maybe there is something about it not being convincing enough. Not sure, not sure in the end, but I think essentially it shouldn't have to matter, but we're a million miles away from that situation. So I would fully support Matt's position on this at the moment.
But I think to me, what's interesting is often we had said, oh, well, if disabled people make it, it'll be better. And I don't believe that to be true. On any level, but that's not intrinsically, because it's about the power structures within the means of production to some extent, and within what you have to deliver for an audience expectation, which will bring me to my last question. But I'm going to let Miro say something on this.
Well, I think what I'm most interested in is the reasons and the tolerance for the exclusion of disabled actors in this context. So yeah, absolutely, it's horrendous that you've got 9 main characters and not one of them is a disabled person within a story exploring disability. But it's usually when you start to kind of unpack that and you read about the justifications given to that, I find deeply uncomfortable. The idea is that there aren't enough disabled actors out there, or the quality of a disabled actor is not as aligned with a non-disabled actor, and therefore it almost gives the director or the director gives them justification to say, well, I can't get a decent actor from the disabled people's community, and yet that's also accepted. And then we and as cinema goers and as film watchers, for the majority of us, majority of us in terms of beyond the disabled people's community, we don't pick this up. We don't really highlight this as a prominent issue. All we do is kind of standalone silo films, and then we kind of dismiss it. So it's a question of why do we tolerate the exclusion of disabled actors? And I build on, I agree with Alison's point entirely in terms of.
To broaden it, but it's not just in cinema, TV, or theatre either, is it? It's everywhere. It's in academia too.
I agree. No, I agree. And I was going to say as well is it's also about going beyond in the context of film. It's going beyond just the acting as well, because the question is how much can an actor influence the narrative of the film and so on. But equally, what we want is actually we want to have disabled people involved in the whole of the film production, and that's a way then of questioning some of these narratives, questioning some of the ways in which we position disability in certain contexts. And of course, it doesn't mean that we are always going to have political films when it comes to disability, because again, a lot of the disabled people's community are not politicized, and they don't talk about the kind of issues that we're talking about or critique it in those ways.
And who would want to watch wholly political films all the time?
No, absolutely not. You would also want to see the rubbish like this. But it's about trying to, for me, it's about trying to question why is it that we tolerate this level of exclusion.
Yeah.
So, and I think what to me is very interesting is that I sense.
Sorry, I'd probably mentioned it before, and I do go. It takes us into all sorts of dodgy areas as this, because one thing that happened with The Shape of Water was the impairment matching stuff, because Sally Hawkins is ostensibly a disabled actor, and she got loads of flack for playing that part. So and a lot of things were written by disabled people about the fact that she wasn't the right impairment, one about her not being from the right culture as well, and it's like. But we don't seem to have a systematic kind of agenda as to what it is we actually want, and I think that's really important. Actually, if we're not after that, what are we actually after? And what does that look like in the interim? Because we all know in the end that if there was an end, that it would look like everybody can go for any job with and disabled people employed throughout the industries. But what does it look like at the beginning, in the middle?
Well, I think the problem of criticising disabled actors for doing stuff and not being the right impairment is often rooted because of the narrowness of what the opportunities are. And that won't be an issue once it's expanded, if it's ever expanded. I personally don't think it ever will be, but but I agree with you completely. But to me, I think often what shows that the filmmakers are actually even very aware of the problems is that sprinkling of real disabled people around it to sort of say, oh, well, we tried, we did our bit, you know, it's there, we really did make an effort, which of course is bollocks. So I'm going to ask you, I think we'll end on one final question, because I think we've covered most of it. And I'll try and cobble it together, and I apologise to the listener if it doesn't sound too good, given our breaks in transmission, etc. If you looked at the IMDb reviews, or the Guardian review, or any review of this, pretty much, normal, and I use that in quotes, normal people love these movies. Why do you think that is? I'll start with you, Alison.
I think a lot, sorry, I am going to say it. I think, unfortunately, and I don't think it just applies to disability, I think a lot of people are more bothered about performance and reputation and looking like they're that they do worthy things and are very liberal in their outlook, and this adds to their portfolio of good things that I do.
Their humanity. It adds
anything I say beyond that will only be the same thing repeated.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it adds to that. You call it their portfolio of humanity.
Yes,
in the most
reputation management, I call it.
Yeah, and equally, because I think there is a terrible move towards this kind of sentimentality. I think I used the example, someone said to me to watch The Repair Shop, because they said, oh, it's about the craft and, you know, there's no fuss and whatever. And then I didn't watch it particularly. And then I watched a couple of episodes because people have recommended it after years. And it's just the most awful sentimentality. And I said this to the people who said that you recommended it, and said, oh yeah, it's completely changed. It's moved away from being about repairing things to being about this adding in, you know, a narrative, a story about, you know, about dispossessed people, dying people, disabled people. And even they think it's awful now. Miro, what do you think? Why do normal people love this shit?
I don't disagree with anything that you've either said. I think just to add to that, when you asked me that question, I was reminded of Howard Becker work on, you know, you have to decide whether you're on the side of the oppressed or the oppressor. And what these kind of films does is it allows people to be complicit in assuming that they are not the ones who are contributing towards the marginalization of people of the communities that we've been referring to. Because such films like this, they reinforce, for me anyway, they reinforce Michael Oliver's notion of the individual model of disability, and of course that is helpful then for justifying the actions and the positions of those who influence and determine what we have access to, and of course if you started to question that, then people then have to start questioning how they contribute to the way in which society is organized, which fundamentally disables us and creates these unnecessary barriers. So these films ride, I think, a wave of saying to the viewer, you know, you've got nothing to be, you know, you're not blamed for anything. You just, you know, it's just about people trying their best to overcome it. And of course, some of these narratives then reinforce that, such as the end of this film, in the American film at the end with the line about just be who you want to be and you'll be fine. So I think for me it comes from that idea of trying to justify to the viewer you're not the problem, you're not to blame. And of course, from a social model perspective, I would question the actions and the activity of all of us and the responsibility that we have to create an inclusive and accessible society. And when we don't have that, we're all complicit in that.
And if you learn the right terminology, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Don't call us horrible things. Call us people with disabilities. The fact that people with disabilities don't exist. Anyway, but that's the social model for you. Anything else from anybody? Alison, do you want to say anything else about it? Like, why? Please don't make me watch another film.
Watch a good film, please.
That's what I said. That's exactly what I did, Mary.
Yeah,
when I came on the call, I said to him, Can we watch something good, please?
Well, I thought for the next one, in a couple of weeks' time or a few weeks' time, we would do The Raging Moon, 1971, which I think you have. I'm pretty confident you have.
I think
And
so.
I am on the lookout for a good one. Although I think The Raging Moon has is awful, but has some things going for it, etc., which we'll talk about then. So The Raging Moon, put that in your diary. If you're a listener, watch it so that you can join in and shout at your listening. And I'll pick up a different one as well, hopefully a foreign one that I'm looking for to make us read a bit more. Anyway, so I will say thank you to both of you, and I'll hobble this together and put it up, and I'll see you next time.